people hear about free trade, they tend to think about agriculture and motor vehicles and old-fashioned things about trade. And trade is good, we all need trade. But there are two problems with the agenda for free trade. The first is it is never free. The more powerful countries are the ones who set the terms, and they set the terms in their interests, which is a bit of an irony now that we have President Trump saying he wants agreements that serve America's interests, because from the viewpoint of many others of us, that's what they've always done. But a second problem with the free trade agenda is that the agreements these days have very little to do with old-fashioned trade. They're about monopoly rights over intellectual property like medicines, or they're about foreign investors' rights, or they're about restrictions on state-owned enterprises. So they're more rules about global economic regulation of the global economy than about free trade. In the earlier agreements, the big push was from rich countries against poor countries. Now we're seeing these new really big agreements that are actually mainly amongst rich countries, which are also putting handcuffs on what the governments of those countries can do. The whole purpose of these agreements is to restrict the right of governments to regulate, the right of governments to exercise their sovereignty, to decide what are the rules that should govern not just economic relations, but policies that corporations find problematic. And so they really are sets of global rules made for international capital and transnational companies that impact severely on poor countries, but also are now impacting on richer countries. The governments act in the interests of their corporations. And if we look at who the big corporations in the world are, they are largely the Anglo-Americans. And some other countries are quite aggressive as well. Australia, New Zealand, who have big agriculture, export interests, and so on. But yeah, effectively, I call it a kind of state-corporate intimacy, where together they design the rules. Well, one of the surprising things about Trump is that when he talks about making these agreements work for America, he seems to be talking less about making them work for the big corporates than actually getting some returns for people who live in the steel belt that make motor vehicles and so on, because actually the agreements in the past have been made for the interests of the big corporations and that have hollowed out much of ordinary America. But we have yet to see whether that will happen, because of course his cabinet has people from Wall Street and people from the big energy companies and so on. And so we understand there's a bit of a battle happening inside the Trump administration about which side will win out. I think there will be probably 3 layers of agenda in the Buenos Aires ministerial. The first will be about, is the WTO still relevant? Because for a number of years, as the Doha round of negotiations that was launched in 2001 became paralyzed, the rich countries have been saying, let's abandon the Doha round and have a whole new agenda that is the new issues for the 21st century, which are the ones that they really want. And they don't want to deal with the development issues that the developing country members of the WTO have been insisting. So there will be this battle about, is Doha going to continue or be abandoned? The second big question will be, if they go down the new route, what are the issues going to be on the table? And they're currently pushing, in particular, electronic commerce. And that sounds kind of benign, who's worried about that. But it's actually kind of the Uberization of the global economy. And that carries with it huge consequences for workers, for businesses, for everything being done from offshore rather than locally and so on. And the third big question is going to be, what role is the US going to play? Because the rhetoric from Trump has been that he doesn't like the WTO because he thinks it's unfair to the US, which again is a little bit mind-blowing. But in particular, it doesn't like the fact that the WTO has a court system that can resolve disputes that are outside, of course, the US domestic court system or in any of our other countries. And the US has been losing some cases. And Trump does not, of course, think that's tolerable. So they are launching a big attack on the WTO. We don't know yet what role they will decide to play in the ministerial meeting. And if they decide not to play the role they have in the past, the geopolitical dynamics will change quite dramatically. So like everything else with Trump, no one knows quite what's going to happen yet. It's a watch this space. In the 1980s, 1990s, the main thrust was to create rules that would work for transnational corporations when they went to invest in other countries. So foreign investment kind of rules and support systems for them, and as well as reducing the tariffs, the taxes that allow the goods to flow more freely. Then we had, as Argentina knows only too well, a period where you didn't focus on production anymore. It was all about finance, and that became very destabilizing because the speculative nature of finance put countries in terrible situations. And the rules in the WTO and the international agreements served those. Now, especially since around 2010, the focus has been much more on digital economies, on the gig economy, on operating through digital platforms, the likes of Amazon that basically coordinate purchases and sales, the operation of global logistics that's coordinated by a central digital platform, or even in local production, you now have smart cars and smart products, sometimes now being made by 3D printers as the vehicle is moving towards where they're going to deliver them. And what they want is new rules that will facilitate that. So you have the likes of Google and others who run the platforms, and the likes of Amazon who are doing the delivery systems, but you've also got companies that think that they're going to dominate the new digital age. And that includes using things like drones and artificial intelligence. And if you think about workers in factories now, how much robotics are there? What kind of surveillance is there watching their every move and monitoring their compliance? So it's this quite scary new digital economy that they want the rules for. And just to give you, say, 3 very brief examples of the rules, they want to say you cannot require someone providing a good or a service to have a presence in your country. So they can just operate from outside the country without any presence here. Second, you can't require that the data about you in your country is actually held in your country. It can be held in a server anywhere in the world. And many of the servers are in the US, which has no privacy protections, has very strong surveillance rules that allow access to the data, has no effective consumer protections for you if this is provided offshore. Yeah? But also, if they're offshore, they'll operate according to their labor laws. So if you're looking at unions being able to protect the not just wages and conditions, but the stability of employment and health and safety rules and so on, those are going to be governed by somewhere else if you still have jobs. Because if stuff is being done from outside the country, it may be replacing your jobs. And so these are really big issues, and they will be in the forefront of the Buenos Aires Ministry. We learned a long time ago never to be too confident that once we have defeated an agreement, it will not come back in some other form. Yeah? And you have found that with ALCA in Latin America, and some of the new agreements which were designed to bypass the paralysis in the WTO, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the Trade and Services Agreement, the TTIP between the US and the EU, all of these have become places to design the new 21st century gold standard rules, as they call them. And since they became troubled, which happened before Trump, they started transferring the same text into the different negotiations. And the TISA, Trade and Services Agreement, those negotiations are still happening. So to use e-commerce in the TPP, almost exactly the same text in TISA, and now we are seeing in Geneva the attempts to put the same text on the table for the WTO to get a mandate to negotiate it there. So they are determined that these rules will become the new platform, the new norm, and our battle to stop them just moves from place to place. Some of us have always watched South Americans with awe. You run amazing campaigns to retain sovereignty and to put the rights of people first. And that was the case with ALCA, and it's been the case with a whole range of initiatives. But we are seeing politics swing back again in the region. And that is a worry in the bigger picture, but it's a worry also for the ministerial in Buenos Aires. One of the tricks of these ministerial conferences is that the government that is the host wants it to be a success. And to be a success means to have an outcome. And so they will push for an outcome. And because the big players in the WTO will not agree to anything they don't like, the outcome is not going to be good for the Global South. And especially because of the disposition of the government in Argentina now, there has to be a real risk that they will push for an agenda that the people of Argentina and the people of Latin America will have to fight for a number of years.